This is the Rock House Center podcast, and I'm John Murphy.
And I'm Beth Murphy, and our podcast today is called Comfort in Crisis. It's actually the second part of a two-part series that we began last week entitled, God is Always Just One Thought Away. This all came about as a result of questions that came in from listeners when we invited questions or topic suggestions for podcasts. It was a cluster of things that all fit into the same category, where loved ones are experiencing worry, panic, or fear, and the person questioning us is looking at how do they comfort them, how do they help them. And so in one case, it was parents and family members who live in a part of the world where they have earthquakes, and they'd experienced one and were having the aftershocks of those earthquakes, and were having their own worry, fear, panic about that. And then one with a spouse that was having panic attack, and a child who had been in a car accident and was very fearful about ever getting back in a car and resistant to getting back in a car. So each of those situations is where the person is in the role of trying to comfort someone else about their difficult life situation, the thing that they're experiencing in sort of a crisis panic mode.
Yes, and so the situation, of course, is that we want to work on the condition of our own heart. The person who's trying to bring help obviously is going to be more effective at that to the extent that they have peace themselves. And that's really what we talk about in the God is Just One Thought Away podcast, is how do people bring God into the context of the moment and to have the peace that they need to have. We have panic, then we are only going to be able to offer panic in our role as a comforter. So it's really critical that we deal with that. Another common belief is that if we just share a common struggle, that's a way to help someone through a situation. And that's not a bad thing. And having community and being able to have empathy for someone because you've been through the same thing is obviously positive. But the most powerful thing that we can bring is the additional piece of, and I have a testimony of how God resolved it. So we always want to bring in God as the ultimate answer. I think that a shared experience shows that we would have empathy in the person's situation when that's possible. But the most critical piece is to be able to bring God in as the ultimate answer. So having a testimony of how he has resolved it, how he's redeemed a situation, obviously puts us in a better position as well.
So the strength of testimony of the person in this role of trying to comfort is really important. So it starts with having their own piece about the situation, not being dragged into the worry, fear, panic that their loved ones are experiencing. So if you look at this particular situation, each person is in a really pivotal kind of role. It's their parents and family members. In the case of the earthquakes, it's their spouse who's having a panic attack, and it's their child who's so worried about not getting back in a car because of a prior car accident. And so taking the child one, particularly because children are so susceptible, they're so responsive to a parent because of the role of a parent. So when the parent is not dismissing their feelings, but addressing their feelings, and part of the way they address the feelings is the reassurance and comfort of seeing that mom or dad isn't themselves worried about getting in the car or having worry and fear about car accidents, and then communicating that the reason is that whatever happens in a car, that God is faithful. God's going to get us through this. He's going to take care of whatever situation comes, and that the place of peace in life comes from relying on God. And of course, it's the same thing for spouse and parents, but it's most evident with the child, and children, again, are most responsive and susceptible to whichever direction, whichever way a parent is living. If the parent is living in panic, worry, or fear, then the child's going to as well, because it's been modeled to them that that's what their parent does. So the God of their youth is resorting to panic or fear, and the child's going to do the same thing. But if their parent, the person representing God to them, is able to be peaceful and model peace and model that God is trustworthy, then the child just absorbs that and lives in that place. And then spouse and parents are going to be also positively affected by our testimony of our peace. And so that's why we started out with God is always just one thought away last week, is because the importance of the person in the role of where they're trying to comfort is to get their own comfort from God directly, with him as our comforter, so that they have something to pass on to the person that they're trying to help.
And of course, we're in the situation with them. We want to be loving them through it. We want to stay present in the situation. And we want to just make sure that we're always pointing to God as the answer. If ever we find ourselves trying to rescue them or be the white knight in the situation, then we're taking on really a role that they need God to take on, because God's really going to have the answer. Because a lot of these situations, particularly some of the ones we mentioned here, these are bigger than we are. They're not bigger than God is, but they're definitely bigger than we are. We really don't have any way to solve these problems. And to the extent that we know that about ourselves and our own situations in life, then we can confidently communicate that. The common thing of all suffering is that for really to have peace and to get to the other side of it, that's going to come only from the degree that which we have relied on God. So loving them through it, staying present, certainly resolving or being available to satisfy any needs they have. I mean, if someone was around a crisis of hunger or a crisis of shelter or a crisis of drowning in a river, you can throw them the life jacket. You're there. We're not saying we ignore that ability to respond and comfort and be the safety net for people. But the ultimate sense of peace about it, and the ultimate resolution, and the ultimate sense of that there is comfort in the future and that God is with them, that can really only come from God. And we do have the opportunity to help people bring God into the context of whatever their suffering is.
One of the things that deepens the problem is the lie that we're experiencing these things all alone, and it's all up to me, really can lead to despair and helplessness. So there's a real positive aspect that the person is connecting with you to get some help and not stay in isolation. So that's good. But we want to recognize that we don't want to cross the line, because their real peace, again, is going to come from recognizing that God's going to ultimately resolve this and bring them the comfort and the peace that they need. So we want to celebrate that they're not staying in isolation and the importance of the relational component here, but knowing that our real role is to facilitate their connection to God, facilitate their trust in God, bringing God into the context of their distress, because that is ultimately where the true and lasting peace comes from.
Yeah, I think the big reminder is that God is on board, and that's a perpetual declaration of God. He says that we are the permanent dwelling place. No matter how it may feel, He is present within each of us through the Holy Spirit. Now, we have, through our control or through our fear or whatever, we have the ability to kind of push Him out of our consciousness and not think about Him and not think He's available. But one of the key things that we need to communicate if we're going to comfort somebody is that no matter how it feels right now, God is on board. God is one thought away. He is available. And if you need some more information about that or more of a sense of that, please do listen to the previous podcast of God is Just One Thought Away, because we really dig into all of the biblical truth that establishes that fact.
So the important distinction here, an aspect of what we're saying, is that we want to recognize that we don't want to become an enabler for someone to
Right.
not go to God.
Right.
We don't want to put ourselves in the God role and then leave them with a dependency on us, because at some point we're not going to be there. We're going to make a mistake. We're going to tell them the wrong thing. We're going to disappoint them. And ultimately, we're not God. No matter what a good job we can do in befriending them, helping them, comforting them, we've not done them any favors if we step between them
Right.
and their ability to trust God. Now we're just enabling them ultimately to stay in a place of fear, despair, helplessness when the next crisis comes along or the next challenge or trial comes along. So we just want to recognize the importance of befriending them, loving them, directing and comforting them, but knowing that the bottom line here is we want to direct them to God through our own connection with God and our own ability to testify to His faithfulness, His love, His comfort, and Him ultimately being the answer.
And I think the one thing that really helps there is just praying to roll the burden of the person's situation onto God's shoulders and to make sure that we leave it there. That's just a really important piece. Is we want to come in and we want to help and we want to be the answer. We want to comfort this person that we obviously care a tremendous amount about. But when we let go of the burden of doing the thing that only God can do, we'll have the clarity to be able to be led by God to do whatever our role is in the moment and to bring Him in whatever way that we can that's helpful to the person who is struggling at the time.
So a leading indicator for me, if I've begun to take on someone else's burden, is that I'm laying awake at night processing through it. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to solve it for them, or anything that goes on our own little worry treadmill kind of a thing, or a sense of responsibility here. We can't possibly be responsible to resolve their situation or get them to a place of peace. And without realizing it, we kind of get into our own fix-it mode, our own control, whatever, some way in which we've slipped away from our own relying on God. And so I'm sure those sorts of leading indicators are familiar to others as well. But what we want to do with that is set aside their situation and recognize, wait a minute, I've done a thing here where I've put myself in your role, Lord. I don't want to be there because this feels too weighty to me. So I'm handing you this burden. I'm handing them to you. I'm entrusting them to you because you love them more than I could ever possibly imagine. You loved them before I was around. You are much more capable than I could ever be to redeem this situation and to do what you promised to do, to use it for their good and your glory.
And of course, when we come in contact with someone that needs help and we're sort of on the scene and we're trying to do what the next step is, certainly it makes complete sense to be praying over them and for them. Absolutely. The prayer that's going to be probably most helpful to them at the moment is going to be a prayer where you lead them through a prayer of bringing God into the context of the moment. And that's really one of the most effective things we're going to be able to do at the time, is to really show them the way to be able to access the peace that God has for them by leading them in a prayer. So you can actually do a repeat after me prayer where you draw them into statements of declaring their absolute trust and commitment to God, to roll the burden of whatever it is they're suffering on God. And we'll have a prayer that will follow here in a minute, and we'll give you some specifics of how to actually say these things. But that's really where we're going to have the greatest impact, is the degree to which we can help them draw God into the moment. We also have situations where we may find that the person has some history of being resentful towards God because they've misread a situation. They feel like God wasn't trustworthy and they have some resentment about that. That's another thing that we can do, is we can help them forgive any past offenses or things they may be holding against God. And so therefore they've been unwilling to trust him or draw him in. And we certainly have situations where people that we've counseled have had thoughts that God had not shown up when they thought he should have, and therefore they weren't willing to bring him into future struggles because they felt like they didn't really know what was going to come of that, and so they had some fear about it.
So that reminds me actually of another past podcast that would be helpful in the context of this, which is that God is not testing you, because we did that because of so many people who come to Rock House Center for counseling with an epicenter of their suffering coming from wrong beliefs about God, where their trials came from, what was God's role in their suffering. There's so much to that if you are experiencing any of that, or the person that you're trying to help and comfort, you recognize that they're doing that's also a really important one to listen to. So the past two ones to listen to that relate to this is that God's not testing you, and that God is always just one thought away. Those all build together into how you're going to be able to help yourself in crisis or someone else that you're trying to comfort in crisis.
Yep. Another aspect of this is asking God to cause our heart to trust God. Sometimes it's very hard because of the situation from the horizon that we're looking at, experiences we had, that we have a hard time trusting God the way we need to be able to have comfort. So one of the things we can lead someone in is, as a part of that prayer, is asking God for God to make their heart trust him. That's another legitimate prayer. I've prayed that prayer many times. I think it's very helpful because God will do that if we open our heart up to him and ask him to invade our heart and change our thinking and to cause us to trust him more. That is a very legitimate prayer. An aspect of this that I think is definitely worthwhile, that some people might think is a little bit silly, is asking God to give you your peace, just outright, just requesting peace. I can remember a situation where I had a lot of anxiety about a certain kind of thing that was going on. I had peace in the past, but this one moment I just suddenly had a lot of anxiety about something I'd had peace about before. And I recognized that I had stopped trusting God about this situation, and the anxiety was really building in me. So I prayed a prayer of asking God to forgive me for whatever it is that I had done to take back control or to not trust him. I asked him to lift me up and put me back on the truth of what the scripture says about his character and how trustworthy he is. And then after I did those two things, I just simply said, God, would you please give me my peace back? And, it was forthcoming. I don't think it's illegitimate at all to ask him for the thing that you want from him. It's what he wants to give you anyway.
Well, when you're praying along with what God has promised and what we know to be his will, you're in the safety zone. It makes total sense to ask him what he's already promised to give you and wants to give you and has declared to give you.
You're praying consistent with his will, obviously.
So back in the context of these three questions that were raised, we're looking at the family members who are in the middle of a natural disaster. Had one fearing another earthquake would come along. And so when you look at what the person in that situation would commonly be experiencing, they probably feel alone. They feel like they're unknowns around the corner and they're looking to their own strength and their own resources to somehow prepare for that and to handle it. That whole feeling of, that I've got to somehow anticipate what are all the bad things that might happen and then get myself totally ready for it will absolutely zap you of your strength and your emotional and spiritual energy because it can't be done.
And it just breeds fear and anxiety because the thing is bigger than you are. And so you need something that is bigger than it is if we're going to have peace. But otherwise, we're not going to get there.
Right. And so, we've had situations where you really can look at the contrast. And all right, so you could just even take this hypothetical thing. So two people that live next door to each other and both of them, say they're in Kansas and they have a tornado and both of their houses are blown down. The way they experience something of that magnitude really depends completely on where they are with God. If they feel like God is doing something to them or has left them and they're despairing, then it's a terrible experience. If they're trusting God minute by minute for where we're going to go from one step to the next, then their experience of that situation, which is pretty extreme, becomes something that ultimately can actually be a spiritual promotion. That can actually end up being closer to God as a result of that really extreme situation that was totally an unknown, didn't see it coming, hadn't planned on it, wasn't what they were going to script in their life. But it's all about getting to a place of being able to trust God.
And that's totally consistent with his promises that he is going to redeem those things which were meant for evil. He's going to redeem those things. So yes, it can turn into a very significant spiritual promotion as the product or the fruit of the redemption is usually going to be a much closer connection with God and a greater sense of resiliency in all aspects of life. So in the situation here, if there's this person who has someone who is in a natural disaster, the first thing they need to do is release that to the Lord. That would be step one. And then they may or may not actually be able to get to these people if they're in the natural disaster to lead them through a prayer. But certainly the prayer is, what do we do? The prayer is to ask the Lord to invade their thinking and to comfort them and to have them be stirred to call out and to trust him in the midst of it. And then if actually have the opportunity to gain communication with them, is that you can lead them through a prayer. Is it, Lord, I don't know what's coming with these shock waves. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I trust you with it. I commit it to you. I ask you to make my heart agree with your will so I know what it is that I'm supposed to be doing in this situation. So that's an example of how it might play out and how you might provide some comfort to someone in a difficult situation like that.
If you think about then a spouse with panic attacks, well, there can be all sorts of reasons for it, but underlying it all, there's probably going to be a fear of losing control. Panic usually has to do with the sense of, I've got to control this. I don't know how to trust God, so it's up to me. And I can see this looming threat where a certain thing might happen, or it might not go my way, or it might not play out the way that I think would be the best outcome. And if I'm not trusting God, that can well up into something that is literally terrifying, this fear of losing control and what life will be like if I lose my grip on trying to make things work out the way I think they've got to work out.
So that's a great example of someone who can be comforted and ministered to by leading them through a prayer of rolling whatever it is that they're afraid of, whatever it is they're processing about, and rolling that burden up on the Lord and ask the Lord to cause his heart to be agreeable with his will, which would be for him to trust God completely in the situation and to have supernatural resilient peace no matter what it is. But there is no way to stay in a place of control and try to operate in control and be free of anxiety and fear. We have to help people move down this pathway towards more and more trusting God in these situations. And that's really the answer. And I can comfort them and I can bring them pillows and I can fix some hot tea and I can say whatever I want to say. But foundationally, there's nothing that I'm going to be able to say that's going to overcome or fix the problem. That foundationally, we need to get God into the context and cause them to engage in a deeper trust with God. That's how the real answer is going to come forward.
So in the case of a child who's experienced a car accident and now is very fearful of getting into a car, there's a similar kind of thing going on in that this sense of this feels out of control. That felt bad to me. I didn't see it coming, and suddenly we were broadsided or rear-ended, whatever it was, and felt bad. And that is fear-inducing. And so the child, most of all, needs to first see that their parents are not fearing a car accident, they're not fearing life, they're not walking around in anxiety or panic, because they are demonstrating that they believe and they know God to be trustworthy. And really the truth is, we're talking about trustworthy even if there is another car accident, because we don't have any guarantees that someone else won't rear-end us or whatever might happen that will cause a car accident. That's not the guarantee. The guarantee is that God's always just one thought away, that he's always there providing more of himself and more love, protection, comfort, using the circumstances ultimately for our good and his glory. So simple affirmations to a child of seeing the parent trust God and the parent verbally communicating that God's trustworthy no matter what is what's going to be the most foundationally important things for that child to have peace.
Yes, I mean, basically, there's so much fear here that this is what happens when people move into a place of dysfunction. I mean, you can have so much fear you can't get in a car, then you have so much fear you can't get out of the house, you have so much fear you can't get out of your bed. So obviously what you have is a tremendous amount of inability to function, because we have to have faith and trust foundationally available to us to even be functional. And so in this situation, you have a child who might be afraid of injury and maybe the pain of it, might be afraid of death, might be afraid because they've been watching some movie that has shown, some horrible outcome of someone having a car accident, and that's what's lodged in their mind. The foundational piece of this is going to be, as Beth was saying, number one, the parents can demonstrate that they function and they trust, and they can see that the gods of their youth are trusting these things, and it's not all about one event, that doesn't determine the trustworthiness of just the functional things in life. But there is obviously a much deeper piece here, which is that this child needs to know on a deeper and deeper level how much God loves him, how trustworthy he is, that the child has been born into eternity and God is with him for eternity, that there's nothing he can do to run God off. If, one of the reasons the child might be afraid of the car accident is because they are afraid of death. They don't really understand that God's going to be there, that there's an answer for that. There's so much around building a strong relationship in a child to be able to manage some of the kinds of fears of these things which can become very dysfunctional. Building an understanding and a knowledge of who God is, his eternity, his commitments and promises to him, the fact that everything that we encounter in this world can be rolled over and given to God, and that he will hold us together, he will cause us to be resilient, he'll cause us to be peaceful in the midst of it. That foundational knowledge is going to be really critical for a child to get past any of these kinds of fears which to us as adults seem kind of irrational.
An important aspect of this that particularly is true with a child, but really with anyone, especially with a child though, is a lot of the comfort that goes on sort of off the topic, not when we're talking about the specific thing they have a fear in this case, a car accident, but just living life and recognizing there are countless ways that their parents are trusting God. And there are all kinds of things that are unknown. There's a whole lot more than just what happens when you get in a car that's unknown. I mean, we're trusting all kinds of things really irrationally. We trust when we go to the grocery store there's going to be food there. Same thing at the gas station, or that the lights are going to come on when we flip the switch, and we're not really processing about those things. We want to communicate to a child and anyone else, but it's certainly a child, that God is trustworthy. And he's even more trustworthy than all those mundane things in life that I just listed, and that we believe that to be true in every aspect of our life. So there are opportunities just in expressing gratitude to God, faith in God, things that are true about his character, his love, his nurture, examples from the past that come to mind to give him the glory for the things that he's done, the things that are building the faith muscle, the trust muscle in us and our child. All of that affects the particular thing they happen to have worry about. And the opposite, of course, is true, that if they're seeing ways in which their parents aren't trusting God, or they're worrying and fearful on things other than the car thing, one way or another, we're communicating what we believe to be true about God, and whether or not we think he is trustworthy by how we lead our lives in the small day-to-day things. And that's what the child and everybody else is absorbing about us. That's what's coming to them as the message we're communicating. So we want to look at big picture, what are we believing and where are we living in our own peace, and what are we communicating by what we say and do and how we express ourselves and what we model to be what we believe to be true about God.
Yes, and also how we model what we do to seek comfort. Those kinds of things that we go to, and if I'm feeling a certain way, I go watch a movie. Or if I feel a certain way, I go have a cookie. If I feel, in terms of if I lose my peace, if I'm needing to be comforted because of a bad situation, where am I going for a solution? To the degree that parents can demonstrate that they go to God for comfort, then that just ingrains within them that God is the answer for comfort, and it begins to build that expectation. So just an interesting aspect of parenting and why it's so important for us, or really as a model or as a testimony to any other person. It's back to what we said earlier, the degree to which we have peace in God and we seek comfort in God and we demonstrate that, and that's a part of our life, then that's going to be very powerful testimony to those people and help them gain their peace by going to God as well. It's probably a good idea to move into a prayer. We have put together a prayer here which will allow folks who need to comfort others a prayer to walk someone through, and this doesn't have to be very specific. There's no perfect way of doing this, but this just kind of hits the main concepts in the way in which we put this together. And so if you have someone right now that comes to mind that needs comfort, this is a prayer that you can pray to set yourself up for being able to help them. And then you can do a version of this to lead them through as well, if you have the opportunity to actually lead someone through a prayer. So let me just kind of get started here and just think of who it is that you are thinking about, a burden that you are under and you're suffering because of the suffering in that person that you care very much for. And you can just kind of fill their name in as we go through this prayer. So Heavenly Father, I roll the burden of, put their name in there, their situation onto your shoulders. I declare that it is your assurance and love they need above all things to have peace in the midst of their suffering. Father, I also roll the responsibility of bringing peace to this person upon your shoulders. I trust and commit them to you. I ask that you make my heart agreeable with your will so that I know how to encourage them to trust you and you alone for peace in their situation. Lord, please lead me in whatever way I need to bring them the reality of your love and your commitment. Father, please reveal to me if there is any way in which I am trying to rescue them in my own strength so that I can fully release them to you. I submit to your plan and your purpose to restore peace and redeem their suffering with supernatural peace and more of your presence in their lives. I pray these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
That's our podcast for today, Comfort in Crisis. Thank you for joining us. Please do send in your ideas or questions, topics that you would like covered in a podcast. And know that we're always here at Rock House Center if you decide that you would like some counseling help or you have someone that you think could benefit.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Goodbye.